Hi, my name is Megan Rhodes. Hi, my name is Nancy Vegas. I just want to welcome you all to our panel today. Each panel member will have about 5 to 8 minutes discussing how their area of expertise has shaped their view on the crisis in Haiti. I'm sure you will all have many questions for them, so there will be a Q&A portion after the panelists done speaking. The first member of our panel is Patrick Sylvain. He is a Haitian-American writer, poet, and photographer, as well as a Haitian language and culture lecturer at both Brown University and Harvard University. The second member of our panel is Elade Eloi. He's the co-founder of the Hope for Haiti Foundation, a nonprofit organization that focuses on education, medical care, and community development with the goal of equipping and empowering Haitians to change their own nation one life at a time.
Our third speaker is Dr. Jennifer Furin. He's a former medical director for Partners in Health program in Lesotho and assistant professor at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Furin has recently worked at Partners in Health sites in Haiti. Our next speaker is Paul Hare. He's a former British ambassador to Cuba and a professor of the Party Center for the Study of the Long Range Future at Boston University.
Our fifth panel member is Wes Yin. He is an assistant professor of economics at BU and a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. His research interests are in the areas of health economics, public finance, and development. So, without further ado.
Thank you. I think we should really start thinking about Haiti in terms of structure. I would sort of address the issue of what I call structural vulnerability. And what does that mean by structural vulnerability? We can start thinking in terms of the entire society or the institutions, particularly from the inception of the society as one in which it was founded primarily on the notion, the economic notion and practice of hyper-exploitation. A country that was hyperly exploited cannot really build sustainable development, sustainable nor viable institutions. So structural vulnerability, it ascertains the fact that Haiti, from the very beginning, was a very weak state with no viable institution. As the country became sort of independent, and as we heard in the previous panel, not only in terms of the superpowers, mainly the United States, England, and then France as well, are vying for control or hegemony, particularly hemispheric hegemony. Now, hegemony has to do with both political and economic. Now, if you have countries like the United States that's emerging as becoming as a superpower, particularly in the instance of building its naval institution in order to prevent France from controlling the Caribbean, with that kind of emergence, particularly with the embargoes that were imposed on Haiti, the structural vulnerability of Haiti became very much, in a sense, very sensitive to the fact that the country could be destroyed both from within or from without, because no institutions were really built in order to maintain a powerful state. And so the embargo of 1804 that lasted up until 1863 really crumpled the society. Furthermore, something in which we don't really address, the result of the 1825 indemnity forced Haiti to create a draconian law, which still exists in 2010, which is the Rural Code of 1826. And the Rural Code of 1826 pretty much forced the peasants to go back onto the land in order to really repay the debt. And no schools were ever built in Haiti from the time of the revolution until 1863. Now, because the country is so structurally vulnerable, in order for both the Vatican, I guess France and the United States to recognize Haiti's independence, they force an external form of education, thus fracturing the society. So now we have a black country that had been pretty much on its own for close to 59 years, 1804 to 1863, and now has to sign a concordat with the Vatican in which Haitians are now have to reject Vodun as their primary religion, reject Haitian or Haitian Creole as the primary language of the people, and to say that they are French, pretty much a French subject by proxy. So that in itself further fragmented the society along not only color line, but also language. Furthermore, in terms of the US occupation, that too fragmented the society because you have, again, think in terms of Jim Crow South, United States, moving into a black country and imposing a Jim Crow South kind of institution, favoring pretty much whites to mulatto as leaders. So now you have within a black country that a majority of the people are not educated. The leaders were educated in French, speaking primarily in French. And then you have a US occupation that's seeing for close to 20 to 22 years a series of light-skinned to white leaders, completely detaching themselves from the majority of the people. Now, what does it do when you have those kinds of issues? Purely alienation, fragmentation, and we could say, in a sense, a form of social and economical fault line that developed. Now, this kind of fault line or fissures, it simply means that most Haitians were subjugated not only to a hierarchical hegemony that existed from within, but also subject to an external hegemony. So the notion of economic development, political institutions, democratization, the vast majority of the Haitians were never involved. Never involved. And so when you see this earthquake, and one asks, well, how is it that a society that has been free for 200 years, how can we blame or simply blame that on history? Well, it started with the fact that the society in itself was never built on an equal footing, that the society never had the resources really to maintain its institutions. Thus, we have a very much a cancer within the society, which is a society that is so young, where the vast majority of the Haitians are under 21 years of age. 500,000 of them, young girls and women, are living in servitude, in what we call the reste avec. So how can this happen in the 21st century, where you have over 500,000 children, the future of that society, who are living in servitude? This is what I'm referring to, the structural vulnerability. And this form of structural vulnerability with those kids, we see, or we saw, and we are seeing, and will continue to see, as far as aid, and the group of humanitarian aids, however you want to look at it, who are taking Haitian children away from the society. This can only occur when you have a society in which the government is feeble. Again, structural vulnerability. You have, as we speak, the United States as a form of pseudo-occupation, pushing aside other societies, Médecins Sans Frontières and so forth and so on, pretty much taking control of the airport and other logistics because the government is so weak. Again, structural vulnerability. Now, why is this extremely important? And how do we move forward? We can only move forward, and unfortunately, the country, in order for it to be rebuilt, it needs the aid of the international organizations. But what about Haitians? How do we move forward in terms of establishing sustainable development, establishing viable institutions, and making sure that the society is not structurally weak? Education is key. Now, how do we establish universal education so that the peasants who were completely removed from the society based on the 1826 code, that now they will be considered as Haitian citizens. And that is extremely important because, yes, all of us, we are Haitians. However, Moun en dehors versus Moun la ville, those people from the outside versus those from the capital, are completely different. Completely different. Okay? And so how do we connect the outside, the countryside, from the city in order to build viable institutions so that for the first time in our history, post-revolution, that Haitians can really talk in terms of a nation. L'union fait la force. In unity, there is strength. We have not had it since 1804. Okay? And so, as we speak, there are Haitians who applauded the fact that Sarkozy went to Haiti, and they're saying, oh my God, we do not want the Americans to take over, so therefore we want the French to come back. And there are those also who are applauding Obama, President Obama, or the State Department, and asking for the United States to take over of Haiti. This kind of conversation can only occur in a society in which there is fragmentation. Can only occur in a society there is fragmentation. We don't know where we're going. We don't know where we are. And therefore, we want outsiders to dictate our future. We want outsiders to reconstruct the nation, or the so-called nation, either United States or France. And so my talk might sound a bit pessimistic, but it is indeed the reality. And that reality is based purely in terms of, from what I studied, this hyper-exploitation that started as far as slavery is concerned, the primary engine for the West, that continues up until the 1915, when the U.S. Navy was really moving forward, using Mole Saint-Nicolas, which is an island north of Haiti, as a primary region for charcoal. Trees were cut in order to use the charcoals as fuel. Okay? And the second motivation, as far as hegemony is concerned, Haitians or Americans are not talking in terms of rebuilding Haiti in terms of a humanitarian issue, but now you have people in Texas are now saying Haiti has oil. And perhaps we can dig not 30 miles into the rocks, but 6 miles. And how do we control this oil? How do we control perhaps the uranium and the cobalt that Haiti has? Not in terms of respecting the nation per se, but it is purely a political and economic hegemony. We started from slavery with the hegemony of the West. Post-earthquake, we are dealing with the hegemony of the West and not the hegemony of the Haitian people. And I will end there.
I want to thank the organizing committee for putting this together for Haiti. I know it's no small task, and I thank you guys for doing this for Haiti. I also want to thank the panel, Mr. Yin, and Mr. Paul Hare, and Dr. Furin, and Mr. Sylvain. It's been 48 days since this earthquake shook Haiti to its core. Most, if not all, of Haiti is used to having its fair share of disasters. We can think back just a few years ago when my beautiful Haiti was hit by 4 successive hurricanes in less than 1 month. We can recall the chaos, the death, the hopelessness after the hurricanes. But in the face of the disaster, and despite having just lost about everything, we saw the Haitian people get up, pick themselves up, and continue the endless search for a better life and better tomorrow. I've been able to visit Haiti twice since the earthquake. And every time I get there and drive through Port-au-Prince and into the countryside, I find myself in utter disbelief of the spectacle and overwhelmed by it. I shake my head at what I see. Young children trying to cope by playing soccer in a small area, no more than 10 square feet. Young adults who should be in school, caring for their loved ones. Another older generation that is watching their kids and their grandkids living in unimaginable conditions. Despite all of this landscape of gloom and devastation, my brothers and sisters in Haiti remain a source of strength and inspiration for me. As we're trying to move on, and these people are trying to live on, how do we go and make a better Haiti? As someone that has been dreaming of better Haiti for our future generation, in the last 2 months, my mind has been flooded with old and new ideas, conflicting feelings, anger, and hope at the same time. I have been jotting down ideas and sketching out my own vision of how our new Haiti should be. Because of the unfortunate event, we have been given an awesome opportunity to truly change Haiti, starting with basic things such as the right to primary and secondary education, as opposed to a privilege. For every child who lives in Haiti today, and for every one of them who will be born on this island. How do we make it possible for every parent to provide an education to his or her child? It is not difficult. We know Haiti has received more than $10 billion in aid in the last decade. So I refuse to believe that as a nation, we cannot afford to provide education to every single child. Out of the kids who do attend school in Haiti, 85% of them attend private schools. Obviously, if the population is living on about $2 a day per capita, there's no way parents are going to be able to afford to send their kids to school. As we talk about education, a country is going to prosper and provide hope to a future generation if there are enough jobs for which its people can compete. We know that when it comes to Haiti, when it comes to jobs, Haiti can be a gold mine because there is not one area in the country that does not need work. Whether it is in infrastructure, information technology, the agricultural sector, education, community development, medical care, etc., etc. We also know that no country in the world can dig itself out of poverty without having leaders that are constantly dreaming for the future generation. And the only way this is going to happen is for such leaders to be accountable. We have plenty of examples where good governance breeds hope and development. Just think of Haiti's closest neighbor, the Dominican Republic. As a country, we have yet to realize 3 successive democratic and transparent elections. Again, I believe that there are people today that are looking for one basic thing from our leaders: accountability. What exactly does that translate to in practical terms? Each cabinet member should have his or her assets accounted for prior to taking a post in the government, halfway through, and at the end of the terms. The people have the right to know that such and such a person did not come to prosper, to power just for self-enrichment, but rather to contribute to the development of the nation. The concept of the public servant must be adapted at all levels of the public administration, and every government official should approach public service as a true calling and not as a guaranteed get-rich-quick scheme it has been. So as we go forward, I see a great future for my beloved Haiti. My hope is that there will be a commission that will be put in place after this disaster. This commission will have Haitians whose life passion is to see Haiti provide a better future for its future generations. The Haitians that make up this panel will be from Haiti, the US, Canada, France, and other parts of the world. They will work side by side with the international community in true collaboration and cooperation. This group of people will take a look at our history up to the pre-earthquake moment and will decide that there must be a paradigm shift in the way the country functioned, governed, planned, and developed. The old way did not work. This commission, in partnership with the Haitian government, will develop a master plan for rebuilding. Primary and secondary schools will be placed and built in key locations throughout Haiti. These schools will, of course, handle thousands of students, and their kids will receive quality education. Medical clinics will be ubiquitous in Haiti. Whether someone lives in a village or a city, such patients will not have to walk for hours and sometimes days just to obtain basic medical care. My fear. I can speak of the future of Haiti and dream. Dreams allow me to hope, but I must confess that I also have a fear. I fear that the hard choices required to help Haitians change Haiti may force all of us who are in position to enable positive change to revert to pre-earthquake status, where education was a privilege, where lottery banks ruled Haiti, and young men and young women who lived without hope. I fear that we may give into the temptation to revert to that time when hopelessness abounded. Hopelessness for the parent and future generations that forces parents living in the countryside, finding themselves unable to send their kids to school, to continue to send their kids to live in the cities where oftentimes they end up on the streets of Port-au-Prince, leading a life many times worse than before and becoming orphans overnight. But I have hope again. As I stand in front of you today, deep inside my soul, I believe our Haiti of tomorrow will have to be better than our Haiti of pre-earthquake. My love, my desire, and my passion for Haiti cannot allow me to fear for Haiti. My dreams for Haiti fuel me, and my hope to have leaders that want to put Haiti on the path to recovery give me the strength to carry on. I will continue to dream for my Haiti, and I invite each and every one of you to continue to dream with me. My hope for Haiti will never subside, and even if it should be my great-grandchildren that will enjoy a prosperous Haiti, I remain confident that it will happen. And this, I'm willing to bet my life on. I thank you again for putting this event together. And God bless you.
So I also would like to thank the organizers for putting this together and for asking me to comment on my experience with Haiti. I sit here speaking to you as a sort of a simple country doctor, and I've been providing medical care in Haiti and been privileged to serve the men and women of that country for the last 10 years. This by no means makes me an expert on Haiti, but the people that I serve are not ever likely to be sitting in front of you in a panel talking about the way that the medical care and disease has affected their life. And so I hope that this is an opportunity for me to be able to bring to you the voices of men and women who've long suffered in Haiti before the earthquake and some of the true tragedy that has come from the earthquake. Haiti is a country that has paid dearly for its freedom in ways that I can't truly understand or articulate. But the lessons, many of my colleagues on the panel are far more skilled than I am at talking about trends and larger social forces that have shaped this. I can tell you the marks and the diseases that I've seen on my patients' bodies. I'm so sorry. And the way that their illnesses have told the tale and the trends in Haiti. So I'll try to do that briefly today. Having worked in Haiti for the last 10 years, I guess one of the things I find surprising about the response to the earthquake is how surprised everyone is about the situation of healthcare in Haiti. For many, many years, those of us who are privileged to live between the two worlds of Haiti and Boston have come back crying and in despair over the health conditions that most Haitians face on a daily basis. It is not uncommon for children to die of diseases that we consider long eradicated. I see men and women suffering the ravages not only of tuberculosis, and of course, when you talk about Haiti, one is almost compelled to speak about HIV, but the long hardship of living under the daily grinds of poverty, malnutrition, worries over where the next meals for their family are going to come from. You know, when we talk about medical care in Haiti, again, everyone, the first thing that comes to their mind is HIV and AIDS, which is really unfair. Haiti as a country has suffered tremendously from this disease, but often the blame is laid on Haiti for this epidemic, and it's simply uneducated for us to perpetuate that myth. But it's not uncommon for us in a day in our busy clinic, which I primarily work in the Central Plateau, but have also worked in Port-au-Prince, to see hundreds of people lined up who've never seen a doctor or a nurse before, not because they weren't sick, but because there was simply none available to them. And so many of us have been battling chronic diseases alongside of our Haitian colleagues for many, many years. And it's both heartening to see the global response to the healthcare needs in Haiti now, but disheartening at the same time that, again, we've been watching people in this country die a slow, agonizing death and crying out for aid for many years without much of a response. And, I can tell you a story of a young boy who I was taking care of in Haiti in August of last year who had a very terrible disease called aplastic anemia. And I don't want to get too medical on people here, but he was 6, and his mother walked for 5 hours to get him to the clinic because she heard that there were doctors at this clinic. And we met this young boy, and it quickly became apparent how sick he was. And although we tried our level best, he required a level of care that was unavailable in Haiti at the time. It wasn't that it was available and we couldn't pay for it. It was simply that the way the medical system has been stymied in that country, the care was not available to him. And although we tried very hard to advocate for a hospital in the United States to provide care to this gentleman, it's hard to call him a gentleman, this boy, no one would take him. And the responses we heard from some very well-respected hospitals in the area were that his problem was not interesting enough to provide care for him here, that we didn't want to encourage Haitians to be seeking care in the United States. They should take care of themselves. And while all this wrangling was going on, this young boy died. 6 years old, and he died of a perfectly treatable disease. And sadly, that's a story in which we were there to witness what happened, but it happens too many times in Haiti every single day. And why is this? I think there are a lot of reasons that we could go into and try to talk about. But, Haiti hasn't had the resources to really build a healthcare system. We go in there with our nice grant to do HIV care, and yet they don't have vaccines. UNICEF goes in there with their vaccines, but they do nothing about malnutrition. There's been no investment made in trying to train Haitian physicians, with the exception of Cuba and the medical schools in Cuba. The medical school that was built in Port-au-Prince by President Aristide to provide care and training for Haitian physicians and nurses after the coup in which President Aristide was removed from the country, that building has been occupied by the UN peacekeeping forces. And it's only recently that medical students have been able to return to school at the medical school in Haiti. During the earthquake, the nursing students at the major university in Port-au-Prince were crushed to death, 200 of them. And so it just seems like a horrific situation has been twisted and made even more horrific. And I'm often at a loss to say words when people say, how was Haiti or how was Port-au-Prince? And I mean, no one expects me to say it was good, but the things that were witnessed and that I saw and the suffering of the Haitians was just far beyond anything that I've ever seen. And I consider that us as a global community are largely responsible for that, because in the face of not having anything dramatic that's posted on CNN, we have really turned our backs on what's been a long-standing chronic problem with healthcare in Haiti. We'll throw money at them, and then we pat ourselves on the back that we did something about HIV, but largely we haven't invested in building primary care clinics in Haiti that can provide care for you whether you have HIV or you're coming in an obstructed labor. We've done very little to invest in a Haitian-run health system. I've been fortunate enough to work with a group that relies a lot on lay health workers, or what are called community health workers, or accompagnateurs. These are lay people who are in the community who provide sort of eyes and ears about who's sick in the villages and provide help to them. We pay them, which we're often chastised for, because somehow people think that poor people should volunteer for a full-time job, which doesn't make any sense to me. But without this, and with the few exceptions of Haitians being offered opportunities in Cuba and some other countries, we as a medical community have put a Band-Aid on the problem and have done nothing to build the Haitian healthcare infrastructure. And we're all paying for that now. Us here, but mostly the Haitians. And it's really with a heavy heart that I speak to you today about how badly we failed Haiti for the last at least 10 years of my life, and how it took something of this magnitude to make us realize this. So the Haitians, I've learned a great deal from them, and they often have many very wise sayings. And one of them is, doing something like sending a lot of foreign aid in to deal with all the broken bones and crush injuries and horrible things we see now, without investing in building a stable health infrastructure that's largely run by Haitians who need the opportunity, very smart. They need to be educated. They need to be trained. To just throw this foreign aid at them is like washing your hands and drying them off in the dirt. And that's sort of a Haitian way of saying, well, what was the point? If you did this, you helped us in the minute, but then you asked us to dry our hands in the dirt after you did this. So I guess if there are lessons to be learned, it's that we need to think about the short-term needs and meeting these medical needs, which are incredibly overwhelming. I don't think the world has faced this, between the ongoing disease, malaria, typhoid, cholera, that this situation is going to breed. We have the chronic TB and HIV epidemics, and then we have these hideous, horrible injuries that were sustained when buildings fell on people and collapsed. And I have to tell you, I've never seen injuries to this magnitude, and most of my colleagues I've spoken with haven't. But if we stop there, if we repair the broken bones and walk away without leaving something behind, and I'm not just talking about tent hospitals and supplies, I'm talking about an infrastructure, a way to train our Haitian colleagues. Where are they going to go to medical school now? Where are the nurses going to be trained? We need to pony up and do some of that here, and then make it a good place to go back, where Haitian doctors and nurses aren't just witnesses to death and dying. Because many of them will tell you, I want to work in Haiti, but all I do is staff a morgue at this point, because there's no medication, there's no anything. We need to commit to that, not just for the next year, but for the next 20, 30 years. And, it's hard. I don't want to sound like a Pollyanna, and I'm not. After what I've seen in Haiti, many of my Haitian colleagues and friends have said it's the end of the world. And I have to say, in many ways, it feels that way as someone who's worked there for a long time. But I think we need to have an eye on the future and have some optimism about what can happen there. The people of Haiti, and I don't mean this in sort of a sort of cute or trite way, they're some of the strongest people I've ever seen in my entire life, and I have a great deal of respect for my colleagues and the people I've been privileged to work with in Haiti. And they have a saying, which on bad days I try to remember, that as long as you have a head, you can dream of wearing a hat. And I guess, I'm sorry, but it's true. And I think that if the Haitians can set that example for us, the least that we can do as privileged people living in a country with all the resources in the world is support them, not in a frenzied sort of, oh my God, we all have to go to Haiti tomorrow and put bandages on little kids in the streets, but in a thoughtful, careful manner that allows us in this time to build a medical structure and infrastructure that can be sustainable in the future and supported by our Haitian colleagues with assistance from people who have resources. And so I'll stop there, but thank you very much for allowing me to be here today.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Congratulations, too, from me to all involved in the Boston Stands with Haiti event. I've never been to Haiti. I'm certainly no expert on Haitian politics or the economy. I have lived in Cuba, and I propose just to say a few things today about the opportunities and the challenges presented to the international community in terms of organization that the enormity of this Haitian tragedy presents. If you look at big changes in the way the international community deals with issues like this in terms of organization, approach, objectives, long-term goals, they tend to be watershed events. Unfortunately, they tend to be big wars, major famines, a plague like AIDS, jolts the international community to look at new ways of doing things. The United Nations, of course, grew out of the Second World War, approaches to terrorism, approaches to genocide, human rights declarations, grew out of people with vision because they were faced with enormous challenges. They were appalled by the loss of life in wars, genocide, and so on. And I think there are ways to look at the Haitian crisis in that context. In the world today, of course, many governments recognize that global issues cannot be dealt with by one nation on its own, however powerful militarily or economically. The number of transnational issues, climate change, terrorism, poverty, the environment, migration, all these things require the world to come together in new sorts of ways. There are opportunities, it seems to me, in the Haitian context to come together, to put aside, if you like, hidden agendas of dominance, of economic interests, and to look at a crisis which requires a genuinely new approach, putting aside even issues of individual sovereignty, collaboration between governments in new innovatory ways. There are obviously opportunities in Haiti for countries who perhaps wouldn't normally cooperate in ventures. Two countries which obviously have people on the ground, have close connections as neighbors, have many of the same motivations are the United States and Cuba. As has been said by Doctor, the Cubans, of course, have long had doctors on the ground in Haiti. They didn't just come in after the earthquake. They've had doctors in many other countries. That doesn't mean to say, of course, that other countries have not provided volunteers, provided aid agencies. Different countries have different models. As we knew very well in Cuba, a lot of the doctors that are sent around the world are sent because, of course, they are government employees. They are effectively owned by the government. Many other countries don't have that sort of model and use doctors through organizations like Partners in Health, Médecins Sans Frontières, and so on. But this is an opportunity, it seems to me, in this medical field, for one, to put aside those different models and to agree that there must be coordination. I was also struck obviously by the problems of infrastructure that were in existence before the earthquake, but in simple areas of governance like registry of births, registry of land. And it seems to me that the global governance experts need to come together to put a model in place which will prepare a new launch pad for the country of Haiti. I think my colleague, I'm sure, will talk more about economic sustainability, but it does seem to me a nonsense that a country as fertile as Haiti is importing 60% of its food supply. As I know, it's very similar terrain to Cuba. Cuba is extremely fertile. They don't, in fact, have a particularly good record in food production, but that is, again, due to a different model. It seems to me as well there's a major opportunity for the Haitian diaspora, the Haitian exile community, to prove that the Haitian tragedy is a model for the way other communities can behave. There are, I know, some very successful business organizations, very successful NGOs which can come together in this tragedy. So I would hope that it can be seen as a model for the future, because in the future there are many other issues, there are going to be many other country contexts where governments of whatever shape or size, of whatever power, have to work together, have to work with NGOs of whatever shape or size or inclination. There can't be competition. There can't be struggling to get your brand name out there to prove that you're the best model or you have the greatest capacity to fundraise. There has to be a new approach to genuine collective efforts. We have shared interests, which we recognize in many areas of the world, including in this tragedy in Haiti. But the challenge for the international community is to translate the shared interests into shared actions. Thank you very much.
Hi, I first wanted to thank everyone for inviting me to speak at this incredibly important panel. I'm an economist here, so my research focuses on health and economic development. So obviously I've spent a lot of time thinking about development issues in general, but also specifically to Haiti. My personal ties to Haiti are actually very personal. Some of my nearest and dearest friends are Haitian, and not only are they Haitian, but they're also incredibly patriotic and deeply caring about their country. And in the years of our friendships, I've gotten to know Haiti quite well, and even had the opportunity to spend quite a bit of time in Haiti, not only in Port-au-Prince, in different neighborhoods, both wealthy, there are wealthy, very wealthy areas of Port-au-Prince, but also the poor areas, as well as in the countryside, as well as cities in the south of Haiti. So while I was there, naturally I didn't have my economist hat on, but for the first hand I could see, the state of private enterprise there, the state of public infrastructure. I naturally had my economist hat on and thought, why is Haiti so poor? So what I wanted to do is spend a little bit of time talking about growth potential and the reasons why economists think growth happens and how that applies to Haiti specifically. But I want to keep in mind here that what I want to say isn't for a tutorial, but really as an example to highlight the roles that good governance or bad governance plays in economic growth, because you can't disentangle governance, whether private or public, from economic policies. And then to come full circle to our very first panelist about how good governance ties in with the role of foreign powers in Haiti's history. So first I want to begin with investments. Now, naturally, we're talking about investments in growth. In Haiti's case, and with many poor countries, investments is really foreign investments because capital obviously is depleted in Haiti. So we're talking about foreign direct investments and how that leads to growth. This is not a prescription for growth. This is just one thing that's a necessary component of a large set of prescriptions for economic development. But very simply, foreign direct investment comes in, taking advantage of one asset that Haiti does have, besides its fertile land, but it's also its human capital. The incomes to investments are split. It's shared among the workers. It's shared among tax revenues to the government. And I bring this up. This is just a transitory benefit for such foreign direct investment. The true benefits of such investments and income really comes with reinvestment. How this income is reinvested into its people, into new industries, into new skills, is really the engine of not just transitory growth, but growth in general and ad infinitum. So new skills, new industries, you can basically think of a system where countries amp up in its level of technology and its human capital, thereby creating new incentives for more investment. More income means that you don't have to rely on foreign investments, but you have domestic investments to reinvest in countries. And this is an engine very slowly over time which can provide growth. And over a span of 30 years, which seems like a long time, but it's really just a blip of an eye, a blink of an eye in the long span of a country's history, you can really see fundamental changes. And we've seen this in other countries. The East Asian countries, 201, have engaged in this type of economic model to have real economic growth. All right, we've seen this in India, we've seen this in other countries as well. Now, having said that, it's just worth pointing out, back to my main point here, not the tutorial, but to highlight the importance of governance, that you need good governance for this to happen. Good governance means when foreign direct investment deals are struck, that there isn't a complicity in resource extraction. It means that when income is generated, it's responsibly invested in new technologies, in education, and these things are critical. Now, it's easy to say, well, why don't we have investments? Well, one thing to note is currently, if you think about if you're a firm, you want to invest in Haiti, there's a 50% illiteracy rate in Haiti. All right, there's been 32 coups in the last 200 years. It's not in an environment that's ripe for such investments and for long-term structural growth. Okay, it's very easy for us to say, well, it's a governance issue, let's blame the Haitian people. But that's a very irresponsible thing. Bad governance is not something that's been built in Haiti in isolation from foreign powers. In fact, our first panel, we had several distinguished people speak very eloquently about the role of foreign influences on selecting or supporting rulers that aren't supported for their vision of public service, but rather complicity in extraction or potential alignment on grand political issues. So I don't mean to end on such a pessimistic note here, but I do want to bring this back to our very first speaker, in that if there's going to be some change in Haiti, and we're talking about governance, right? It's actually quite irresponsible just to look at Haiti alone, but any change begins with some awareness about the role that other powers have played, particularly the United States in the 20th century. So we can begin with that awareness.
My name is Ellen Evett. I've been working with Haiti for over 10 years, basically as an artist. I'm a designer and have been trying to help women market their works that come out of Fond du Blanc. I've been watching this here in the Boston area, just on pins and needles every day. It looks like, in the overall picture, the terrible immediate problem is the 300 camps in Port-au-Prince that all they've got is cotton bed sheets and sticks. Of the NGOs that are in there now, and I know that the government has been active. Somebody sent me a proposal that was a wonderful proposal. I guess the main body of it was written before the earthquake, but it was like just everything that you would hope for, including a train, which I've always said, if there was only a train. So it was like there was a wonderful, this was coming from the government of Haiti, but it's like, what is the immediate problem right now of the agencies fighting one another, that we can't get these camps moving, and also like the semi-permanent sites that obviously have to be out of Port-au-Prince to move the people?
Well, I'm sorry, was there a question, because was it simply a comment?
No. What is the problems that you see of getting immediate shelter in the city and the sanitation, and also the immediate problem of other sites that are the semi-permanent sites, so people aren't congested right now in Port-au-Prince?
Right. Well, the government, if we can call it a government, there's never really a vision, again, of pure governance. If you have a serious government, there are contingency plans. If this happens, we will do this. And if this were to fail, we will do this. We have had several earthquakes. We have had several catastrophes. And the Haitian government, as well as, in a sense, the Haitian diaspora, has always been reactive instead of proactive. Okay? And so now they are, with all of the institutions that completely physically collapse, the government is really operating pretty much ad hoc. And their functioning or functions depends on their international organizations, particularly the United States. But at the same time, as far as distribution is concerned, you mentioned the NGOs. There are over 10,000 NGOs in Haiti. And each of the NGOs, most of them, are not really there to care particularly for the people. Many of them do have a religious bent and objection. So you have few NGOs that are working, that have worked in partnership with the government. Partners in Health is one of them. Focal is sort of well known for what they've done. And so you have Haiti as this massive cake in which all flies, insects, and whatever other entities, if you can call it animals, I'm not being politically correct here, are really feeding on this entity, this cake. And the cake, within it, there is a government. And the government, in a sense, sometimes is extremely happy that you have NGOs doing the job in which it's supposed to do, because the government doesn't have the capacity, and the government, in a sense, also does not have the vision. Because this is a society in which there's no social security. And people move into the government in order to profit for themselves. So you're dealing, as Professor said, an issue of governance and accountability. You're dealing with the whole notion of a nation. What does it mean to be a nation? Right? The United States. We have so many different immigrants, but once we move in, whether voluntarily or not, but the vision of the state, the vision of the nation to be an American is respected in so many different ways. Whereas the notion to be a Haitian is not respected because that whole notion doesn't exist. And so the NGOs or whatever else can move in and do whatever else they want. And the government is simply sitting there, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and just also say, you know, in the midst of all the chaos, there's not really any one body that's driving the bus down there right now. And so the Americans are doing their thing and the French are doing their thing. And it was very discouraging to see, because you'd like to think at a time like this that people could put their differences aside and pull together for the good of humanity. But unfortunately, for reasons that I can't fully explain, there's still a lot of egos around. Nobody really thought or planned this, and it's a shame because people say, well, gosh, nothing like this has ever happened before, and certainly that's true, but this isn't the first disaster the global community has faced, and it's certainly not going to be the last. And we end up running around like children after a soccer ball, and no one stays in the backfield to think about things. So they say send surgeons who are there, they do their surgeries, and then they leave, and then everyone's shocked that there's nowhere for people to sleep because no one thought to buy tarps. And so it's, you know, things like this that are just maddening, because I think we should be able to do a better job with this. And well, you know, the UN cluster system, you bring it up, and we always kind of joke that that was an interesting name for them to have given to a system that seems to get caught up in its own cluster itself. And I'll be polite by not adding the second word that everyone knows what I'm thinking about. But you know, the UN cluster system, they didn't take a lead, and they sort of let everybody ride roughshod over them. And people will say it's, well, you got to feel for the UN, because they did lose a lot of people in the earthquake. But I have to tell you, the UN people on the ground in Haiti are not the same UN people who are occupying the nice offices in Geneva and supposed to coordinate this. And the problem as I saw it, and again, I can't speak to how the cluster system has worked in other disasters, is that most of the American NGOs or groups that went down there with good hearts don't even know that system exists, nor were they trying to be accountable to it. And so I think it was a lack of accountability. It's a lot more glamorous to be, you know, digging children out of the rubble and trying to put IVs in them than it is to hand out tarps. And so, you know, as an anthropologist, which I also am, I could sit back and look at that in a detached way, although it made me feel sick, and try to understand why it is that we seem like a bunch of chickens running around with our heads cut off and unable to meet the need in spite of the hundreds of millions of dollars that have been raised and the tens of thousands of people that are there. And I don't have a good answer, and I think it's shameful. So,
if I may add a comment to that, somebody earlier on the earlier panel, I think it was Miss Gina Ulysse, she mentioned that the complexity of our issues in Haiti, and they are complex, and then they're not sound bites. It requires, I tell people, to do something in Haiti, it requires sweat and patience. But it also, patience means it's long-term development. We know today, to touch on your point of clusters in Port-au-Prince, I have been to Haiti twice since the earthquake. and then I talk to people on the streets. I also listen to interviews on the radio. People are not moving to outside of Port-au-Prince. They have their home that's been collapsed, and their house is collapsed, but they have the land. They know they can rebuild. So they're not moving out to Quadabouquet, that I've heard, but I think they will if the government takes because right now you need someone to lead with courage. So there has to be, you're going to make decisions that will hurt a few, but help the majority of the country. So this is where I think that the government we need to help the government step up and then make some decisions that are tough, but also good. I think we can build outside of Port-au-Prince. People will come, but there is no trust. The government will build. There is no trust between the people and the government. They haven't had the evidence of results for 2 centuries. Therefore, they refuse to believe the government will do what they said they're going to do. That's one thing. The second thing is, speaking of UN, that word kind of makes me sometimes sick because for what I've seen in Haiti for the last 10 years. UN, but now in the UN, the whole international community, speaking of complexity, we have given loans to Haiti and aids to Haiti, but with certain conditions that I've heard that 70% of every dollar that goes to Haiti come back to the donor countries. 70 cents of every dollar that goes to Haiti come back here or Norway or France on consulting fees or vehicles purchased and so on and so forth. So those are all issues that need to be highlighted and then need to be addressed and then be confronted head on. If we don't have those frank dialogues, I am afraid that we will revert back to where we were before. Bad governance, no long-term planning. An example of long-term planning, in 1994, Clinton took Aristide to Haiti. 10 years later, Bush took him out. So 10 years, a lot can happen in 10 years. The reason that we took him back and take him out in 10 years, because there was no planning for the next generation. So again, the issues are complex. It's not sound bites, and then we have to have a strong and then hard dialogue to really help Haiti go forward.
So one of the things I've heard about is that there will be some Haitians coming to live in the U.S. And I know that I don't know if we have actually appropriate organizations to help these people just, getting culturized, get a job, live here. I mean, we're already having problems with giving jobs to the people already exist here. So how do you think the Haitian community, either in Boston or in the U.S. in general, are going to help with this? And how is the Haitian community should react to what's going on in Haiti now? Thank you.
Anybody? You can start. I mean, years ago, I told President Aristide that the whole notion of community, we need to be careful with it. There isn't a Haitian community. There are Haitians living in a large area that we call a community because it's not organized. In order to have a community, it has to be cohesive. It has to be institutions, okay? As we've seen with the Chinese community or Korean communities, for example, Irish communities. We have a group of Haitians who happen to occupy a physical space and shared somewhat interest, and they convene around sort of communions and musics and parties and so forth. We've had few Haitians who are elected, but they were never elected by so-called Haitian communities, right? So in order now to absorb those Haitians who are coming in, you have to have a community. You need to have a structure that can indeed hold and acculturize the new immigrants. In Miami, you have certain centers that are fighting in terms of legal issues, but a lot of the money that they receive come from either Catholic charity or other association organizations that are not Haitian. So you need to have the wealth to be, in a sense, independent. You need to have the political will for you also to be more or less to have a cohesive group. We don't have that. So pretty much, as Gina mentioned earlier, we are at the mercy of the larger community, or we are at the mercy of, we can say, the white community. So if with the absence of your help, there is no real Haiti. Because the other issue, which some of my students were already talking about it, many of the parents or relatives who've welcomed cousins and aunts and so forth, the Haitians who are currently already living in a very tight space, 6 or 8 people in a 2-bedroom, and now you have 10, 12. For how long can they sustain this kind of arrangement before they themselves become really tired of this kind of cramped space? That is our really real issues we are not even begun to address yet. And it's not only just in the States, but also in Haiti as well. Because people living Port-au-Prince, moving to the countryside, are welcome in the 1-bedroom, 2 bedrooms, okay? But pretty soon, the resource is going to be meager, and pretty soon we'll have close to nothing. You'll have to leave. You'll have to leave.
So there are communities currently. I can take an example of Durham, North Carolina. There are some Haitians that have come with Duke Hospital and UNC Hospital. They are currently in the hospitals, and I know a few Haitians that are visiting him frequently. My daughter goes to Duke, and she also one of those people that kind of keeps aware of what's going on with them. So it's Patrick Sylvain is correct. We don't have the model of the Asian communities, for instance, that we can see, or we're not there. But there are the bigger issues that cause us not to be there. Most Haitians that come to this country to work, like in their 30s and 40s, they not necessarily are educated. So we have an education issue. Just like we heard from the stats, 50% of Haitians are illiterate. So some of them are coming here. They come here sometimes they add stress to the people here who are working hard to send money back home. Because the reason why Haiti survives, the reason why Haiti lives, is because of Haitian in the diaspora. In 2008, $1.25 billion were sent to Haiti by the Haitian diaspora. That's 1.25 billion as in B. So the Haitians are working to help home. So the idea of health, of wealth, we are not there yet in terms of establishing a culture, establishing a society or a community where Haitian comes and then there is a group of people that are ready to put them into housing. We don't have that yet. And my dream, if I were to dream, is not to have it. The reason why I'm saying not to have it is that we want Haitians to stay in Haiti and work and change our country. Coming here is not the answer. Coming here is you escaping life in Haiti because you have no choice. You come here, but that's not the answer. The answer is staying home and then work to change our country. But the opportunities are not there. Therefore, they have to come here. So the idea is to keep them there, Haiti, but they come. So we have to deal with that.
All right, unless there are any more questions, we're going to have to close the event because of time. Do you guys have any more comments that you want to make? No? All right, we want to thank you so much for coming and for providing us with such important information. And I also want to thank you guys, the audience who came here. This is a very important issue. And you can donate on the back, but more than that, I just want you guys to spread awareness is the best thing you can do. Instead of volunteering, you can volunteer. You can do a lot of things, but just the awareness of an issue is going to do a lot more than $1. And thank you so much for coming.